to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Gaza is a news graveyard. That's according to the Costs of War Project at Brown University. It says the war in Gaza has, since October 2023, killed more journalists than the U.S. Civil War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s and 2000s, and the post 9/11 war in Afghanistan combined. At least 232 journalists and media workers have been killed since the war in Gaza began. That's according to Brown University. Some appear to have been targeted by the Israeli army, while others were killed alongside civilians. On Sunday, the number of journalist fatalities grew when an Israeli airstrike hit a tent camp in a hospital complex in southern Gaza. A journalist named Helmi al-Faqawi was among the 10 killed. At least 9 other journalists were severely injured when the encampment caught fire. It's been said that you can kill a journalist, but you can't kill the story. This unflinching spirit of the press to seek out the truth and report it at any cost is central to the Gaza Project. It's a collaboration with over 40 journalists across a dozen news organizations. Forbidden Stories is coordinating the project. It works to continue and publish the work of other journalists facing threats, prison, or murder. Hatta Osman is the executive editor at Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. It's among the news organizations working on the Gaza Project. Hatta, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you very much for having me.
So later on in the show, we'll discuss some of the journalists who've died reporting on the war in Gaza. But first, could you tell us the genesis of the Gaza Project and why Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism got involved?
The project really started in November of 2023, so 2 months into the war, because even at that point, the scale of the attacks on journalists in Gaza was already unprecedented. We often hear this line and we see it written that this is the deadliest period for journalists since the Committee to Protect Journalists began tracking those killings in the early 1990s. But what people forget, or maybe don't realize, is that this record was broken very early in the war. So the number of journalists killed now, which you just mentioned, this Brown study, is unprecedented, whichever way you count it. So during those very first weeks, we were already alarmed. Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, ARIJ, what we do is basically we work on investigations with Arab journalists. So we had long-standing connections with journalists in Gaza. I personally had worked with journalists over there, and we were in contact with them, and everyone was just in shock, and we felt an urgency, not just as journalists, but also as colleagues, to understand what was happening and to investigate it. There was one specific investigative idea at the time that sparked everything, and we began to explore it, and it led us to connect with Forbidden Stories, and they take and deserve full credit for scaling this into what it has become, which is a major collaborative effort, as you mentioned, over 40 journalists and over a dozen news organizations. So we came together, and there are 2 parts to the project. We published the first part at the end of June 2024, and the second batch of investigations was just published at the end of March. We worked together. We started by looking at this long list of journalists. When we started working on the project, it was over 100 journalists, and we looked at the list to identify cases in which an investigation would be possible and it would be helpful, and started working on those cases. And we also worked, it's important to mention, on the targeting of press infrastructure in addition to the journalists. And basically, we put out all of our resources and skills together, something, at this scale wouldn't have been possible without us doing that. and decided on a number of cases to investigate. We published with the first part over 20 investigations in 6 languages in multiple countries. And that's how it all started.
In 6 languages in multiple countries. So this helps to elucidate the need for so many people to be working on this project. And again, you're working with over 40 journalists across a dozen news organizations. Can you paint a little bit more of a picture of what that looks like from like a logistics perspective?
I have to say that Forbidden Stories, as sort of a project managers, they did incredible work in coordinating between all of us. We had, depending on who's interested in which leads, we created the chat groups. We had one place online where we organized all the information that we were getting. We uploaded everything that we had, and we had certain journalists working on certain leads, and then we would all just like, if someone needs something related to OSINT, which is open source intelligence, visual forensics, audio forensic analysis, geolocation, then there's someone who knows how to do this. If we did a lot of the interviews because we had these connections in Gaza, and we also spoke Arabic and knew how to approach and do these sensitive and deep interviews. So we're all just like work together, and anyone who needed something just asked for it, and anyone who knows how to do it did it. And the really the key to these big collaborations is what we always refer to as radical sharing. So there's no competition. We're all just working together, sharing everything that we get, and in the end, it ends up benefiting all the different journalists and the media organizations.
Radical sharing. Yes, that seems to be what the future of journalism hinges on is more collaborations, more ways that we can work together, especially when you talk about this kind of deep investigative work. Now, as you mentioned, the Gaza Project has a part 1 and now a part 2. What are some of the the key findings from part 1?
I would say that in addition to the individual stories, and I can speak about some examples, I think the journalists in Gaza had been telling us and trying to tell the world that they're being targeted. The sheer number in itself, must draw some, shock and some curiosity into how come that large of number of journalists is getting killed. And they're telling us this. And it's to be honest, like I have to say that it didn't seem like people were listening. So I'd say collectively, by doing these different investigations over 20, in the different languages, there were some stories that were variations of like the same story. Um, it showed that there are cases where there was targeting, but also just we did an analysis of the numbers. And in that part 1, we found out that most of the journalists had been killed actually while they were at home. So this idea that these journalists are in dangerous areas where there is fighting or there's combat, there are in combat zones, and that's why the risk is high. So that's why they're getting killed in such large numbers. Is simply not true. They're getting killed at home with their families a lot of the time. And then we had one important story. We did a forensic and audio analysis and proved without any doubt that the building for the AFP building, Agence France Presse, the French press agency, had been directly fired at by Israeli tanks. We were able to locate exactly where the tanks were. And this incident is important because it's just an example of how the Israeli military had lied about the reason for the attack. There was damage to the building. AFP asked the military to explain it, and they said initially that there were clashes nearby. But then, we looked at the damage, we showed it to military experts, and we did all these different like forensic analyses that showed that this could not be true. Uh, and this was like one case. It's important to also always examine the Israeli response and look at it in a way that is, that questions it and asks more questions. Unfortunately, we don't always get, because we're a large group. We were fortunate to get any response from the Israeli military. Sometimes smaller groups or smaller media organizations that don't have a lot of influence do not get any response. But the response, unfortunately, is usually either generic. We don't target journalists. We refuse this accusation without responding to specific questions. Our questions are extremely detailed and lengthy about each and every case, but we don't get satisfactory answers.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Our guest is Hadda Osman. She's the executive editor at Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. It's part of an effort investigating the deaths of journalists called the Gaza Project. Now, this project has uncovered untold details about the apparent targeting of journalists by Israel. What has the response been like to your investigation thus far? I mean, you did mention that you felt that it was not getting enough attention. Why do you think that is? Why is it not getting enough of the spotlight that you think it warrants?
Let me start first by not speaking about the project getting the attention, but this crisis not getting attention. When journalists have been attacked elsewhere in other places around the world, and I want to be clear that nothing compares to the scale of what has happened and is still happening to the Palestinian journalists in Gaza. But in those other cases, the reaction from our global journalism community, it's usually swift, it's vocal. In Gaza, the response, I have to say, it just feels subdued. There are statements, yes, there are legal filings by some organizations, but where is the unified outcry? Where are the editorials, the headlines, the walkouts, the images that express a collective outrage, collective support, making this visible in a way that it can't be ignored? I have to say that doesn't match the scale of what's happening. And I'm not dismissing or diminishing the incredible work done by organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists or Reporters Without Borders, and also all the regional and the local organizations. They've issued important statements, filed lawsuits. There's a lot of behind the door work that we don't know about. But where's the broader journalism community, the newsrooms, the editors, the broadcasters? What is being done is just not enough, and it has not met the moment. And the danger of this, of us not standing up and not speaking up against this, is that we're normalizing the idea that some journalists' lives are less worthy of protection than others. We should be asking, why is that, and what does it say about us as journalists and about journalism as a profession?
And we know dangers to journalists in Gaza and the West Bank. It's nothing new. I'm thinking about in 2021, an Israeli airstrike destroyed the Associated Press's office building in Gaza. Israel said the building housed military intelligence. The Associated Press's president denied that. Then in 2022, a prominent and celebrated journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, was shot in the head by Israeli forces while she was reporting on raids in the West Bank. Abu Akleh was wearing a press vest at the time and alongside other reporters. Now, Israel denied targeting Abu Akleh, saying she was caught in crossfire. Reporters there disputed that claim. The United Nations conducted an investigation and concluded on reasonable grounds that Israeli forces used lethal force without justification under international human rights law. That's a quote from the United Nations. Now, according to your investigation, this is a pattern, Israel's apparent targeting of journalists. But Israel says things after journalists are killed, like Hamas was in the area or that journalists were connected to Hamas. Can you talk about that?
Yes, there is no question that it is a pattern. And that's not just me saying this. There's an incredibly important report that was issued by the Committee to Protect Journalists in May of 2023 on the anniversary of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, called Deadly Pattern. And it examines 20 years of this pattern. And it examines also 20 years of impunity and lack of accountability, because in no case has there ever been any accountability. No soldier, even we don't know who's the soldier who killed Shireen Abu Akleh and what kind of action has been taken against the soldier, if any. What's also becoming even more dangerous now. And we've seen an increase in this, especially in the past couple of months since the or the past month also since the ceasefire was broken on March 18th, is these accusations against the journalists themselves. So Israel, kills journalists, including the cases of the son of Wael al-Dahdouh, and also recently the case of Hussam Shabat, and then accuses them of being connected to these militant groups and refuses to give enough evidence to support these claims. It just throws the claims. We've actually asked as a consortium for additional information with regards to one case, and we were told that we're not going to elaborate on the statement that we issued.
Coming up, we'll continue our conversation with Hada Osman of Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism about the journalists who've been killed in Gaza since the war started. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us.
On the Metro, we value honest conversations, not outrage, and we pursue truth, not scary headlines. That's because we work for you, our listeners. The Metro is community-supported and locally produced, two things we know our members value and appreciate. In a time when local news and public media face economic uncertainty, it's important now more than ever to support the programs that reflect your values. Consider becoming a member of WDET. It's the best way to invest in community-focused conversations and news. To do that, go to wdet.org/give.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. It's been said that you can kill a journalist, but you can't kill the story. This unflinching spirit of the press to seek out the truth and report it at any cost is central to the Gaza Project. It's a collaboration with over 40 journalists across a dozen news organizations. The project is investigating the deaths of journalists who've been killed during the war in Gaza. Now, since the war began in October 2023, at least 232 journalists and media workers have been killed. That's according to Brown University's Costs of War project. It says the war in Gaza has been more deadly for journalists than most other modern conflicts combined. These journalists are working to investigate the rising number of journalists killed by Israeli forces since the war in Gaza started, and they're also working to continue telling the stories that their colleagues were killed trying to report. Hada Osman is our guest. She's the executive editor at Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. It's among the news organizations working on the Gaza Project. Now, Hada, what are some of the stories you want to continue reporting that were being covered by Gazan journalists who've been killed?
So one of the stories in part 2 of the project, which was published just less than 2 weeks ago, is about drone journalists. So drone journalists in Gaza, there weren't that many. We expect that there were about 10 drone journalists. Drone journalism in Gaza had existed since 2014. It's not new. It's not, it's not considered, because like for many people, when you say that a journalist is using a drone, it's maybe new to people who are not like informed about the situation in Gaza, but it had been used for a long time, and they were getting killed. Five drone journalists had been killed. One drone journalist was seriously injured. His legs were amputated. So together with Forbidden Stories, who, as you mentioned, their mission is to continue working on stories that journalists are unable to continue. We and Bellingcat, we worked on to continue the work of some of these drone journalists. So what we did is that we filmed in Gaza with a drone. There's a really sad and tragic story that I'm going to have to tell you as I tell you this story, which is that the drone journalist that we hired, Stories had hired for this project, a few days after he had finished filming with us, he was filming for a UK-based charity organization, and that journalist himself was killed in an Israeli strike. So the tragedy of a drone journalist working on an investigation about the killing of drone journalists and then getting killed himself.
Wow.
His name was Mahmoud al-Bassous. So we used Mahmoud's footage, the one that he had shot in 2 areas in Gaza, and with the help of Bellingcat created what's called photogrammetry models. These are 3D models. You can go on our website or on Bellingcat's or Forbidden Stories, and you'll be able to navigate yourself through these models. It gives you the feeling of just being on the ground and being able to really grasp the damage and the destruction more than if you just see it from the air with satellite imagery or just with the regular drone imagery. So there are 2 areas in Jabalia and Shati camp where we were able to do this to continue, because those 2 areas, one of them is Shati, Abdullah al-Haj, one of the drone journalists, he's the one who's been injured, was filming there when he was hit. And Jabalia was off, limits for a lot of the journalists because of how dangerous it was. So this part of the project of continuing the work of journalists included this photogrammetry project.
I want to stay on this topic of drone footage of the war in Gaza and how crucial it has been in helping us to understand the devastation and destruction there. I mean, those zoomed out shots are the scenes that really have put us into, they've given us so much more of a grasp of what is happening there. Can you talk about that?
Yes, of course. There's no way from the ground to be able to grasp the scale and the magnitude of this destruction as much as you do when you see the drone footage, which is why drone, journalists are so important and their work is so important. I have to say that now, this is all done. And it had been actually also complete, like journalists knew after they were like targeted one after the other, not to do that. Mind you, Israel at no point did it issue in public or official statement, not that we know of, we looked for it. There's nothing officially saying journalists shouldn't use drones in Gaza or we will, they will be a target. Nothing officially from Israel that bans the use of drone by journalists. If they had done so, their lives would have been saved. So extremely important. Gone for now. We're not going to be able to see any drone footage anytime soon, especially after the strikes against Mahmoud and his colleagues.
Could we talk about some of the other fallen journalists? One of them that I'm thinking about is Hassam Shabat. He was 23 years old. He was a Palestinian war correspondent for Al Jazeera and also contributed to Drop Site News. He was killed just in March. What was life like for him on the ground reporting in Gaza? Can you speak to that?
It was a really sad day. That day that we got the news that Hussam was killed. I interviewed Hussam a couple of months ago. We talked for over an hour. Very energetic, very articulate young man. He at the time described an impossible life, filled with challenges and difficulties. He talked to me about how he couldn't find a place to sleep and often slept in his car after long days of work. You have to think of these journalists, especially also the North before the ceasefire, and now of course everywhere. But like it was extremely difficult for the journalists in the North. There were much fewer journalists in the North. Hossam was in the North than in the South, and just like food and like just safe place and constantly you have to remember that Hussam was accused by Israel of being connected to militants before he was killed, months before he was killed. So he's walking and working every day, knowing this. He talked to me about this, about how he just gets accused and then he becomes a target, and then as he goes about his day and he works nonstop, this is constantly something that is there. Um, and then just like that, he's this was like I also want to note that the Committee to Protect Journalists, in cases where after the journalist is killed, Israel admits it and accuses the journalist of being connected to militants, they often categorize this as murder, because there was an admission that this journalist was killed, and this was the case for Hussein. Just a life, that's just ended. This vibrant, he was so persistent and he was so adamant, like when we talked, that he's going to just continue working and nothing will stop him.
And then there are other journalists who managed to survive but are going to live with very deep scars from this work. I'm thinking about Fadi al-Wahidi. Last October, he was shot in the neck during an assignment. He was clearly identified as a journalist. Now he's paralyzed. The Gaza Project has found that he was not working in an evacuation zone, meaning he wasn't in an area where he would have necessarily been unsafe. Could you tell us more about what you know?
Yes, of course. The case of Fadi al-Wahidi was one of the major stories we did for part 2 of the project. As you just explained, Israel the day before issued and posted these maps. We have a picture of it in our story, where it color codes areas based on which area is an evacuation area, meaning that everyone in that red area has to leave this area, and the yellow areas, which are not evacuation areas. We geolocated, and when I say geolocated, means like we've determined where Fadi exactly was based on the videos and the buildings around him, based on also metadata that we get from footage of videos of people who were in the area. So without a question, they were not in the red area. They were in the yellow area. He was wearing a press vest along with the other journalists. We've interviewed 6 journalists who were on the scene that day, including Fadi, broad daylight, and he was shot in the neck.
Oh, Hada, you speak to these journalists daily. Could you put us into the shoes of some of the journalists who are still alive, who are working in Gaza, a place that the Committee to Protect Journalists says is the most dangerous in the world?
I have to say that the admiration and respect that I have for these journalists is just, I can't even describe it, because they just keep on going. They, you know, I speak to journalists who go from one loss to another loss to difficulty to, and yet they continue working. And I want to give you just some examples. They're mostly living in tents. Arish, by the way, did a survey of the journalists to see how they're living, what difficulties they're facing, and it's also on our website. It just draws a horrific image of how journalists are living today. One of the journalists recently sent me, it was raining in Gaza, and sent me, they're already all in a tent, and she sent me a video showing how everything that's in the tent just got flooded and the roof was off, and they had to just figure out how do we all like just restart again after having moved so many times. A lot of the journalists have been displaced multiple times. That is not to mention personal loss. There's the journalist I know who lost her a toddler child, and just went to the market and just like was killed in one of the attacks. And a few weeks after that, she contacted me about like applying for a fellowship and continuing work, and it's just unbelievable grief and loss, and in spite of that, just resilience and continuing to work. So they're an inspiration for us to continue doing our work as well.
Hada Osman is the executive editor at Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. It's among the news organizations working on the Gaza project. It is investigating the unprecedented numbers of journalists' killings in Gaza. Hada, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. And this is The Metro. Stay with us.